Welcome back to the Deep Dives. I'm your host, and today we are doing something that, well, it sounds incredibly simple on the surface, but I promise you this, it is going to get very complicated very quickly.
Yeah, hi everyone. And you're not kidding about it getting complicated.
Right. So we are looking at a map today. Specifically, we're zooming way in on a single tiny rectangle in West London.
Basically a patch of grass surrounded by some railings and bricks.
Exactly. Just a square. We are talking about Earl's Court Square. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking a square. We're spending this entire deep dive on a single square.
It sounds a bit entirely too niche, right?
It does.
Yeah.
But the reason we picked this, and the reason our research team went absolutely overboard pulling all these historical records and architectural surveys, is because this isn't just a location on a map.
No, it really isn't.
It's what you might call a microcosm of London history, a true core sample of civilization.
I love that. That is the perfect analogy. Because if you're a geologist, right, and you want to understand the history of the Earth, you don't just look at the surface. You drill down.
Right, you take a core sample.
Exactly. You pull up this long cylinder of rock and you look at the layers. You see the sediment, the bedrock, maybe the ash from a volcano from 1,000,000 years ago. Cities work the exact same way.
And Earl's Court Square is one hell of a core sample. If you slice through the history of this one specific location, you don't just see a changing London. You see these absolutely wild contrasts in the human experience.
The extremes.
Yes, the extremes. We're talking about the highest of high society, Victorian ambition, the literal founders of the Royal Ballet.
Crashing headfirst into the grittiest, darkest parts of the 20th century.
Exactly. It's a stage where the scenery just keeps changing.
One minute it's just agricultural calm. The next it's the home of an inventor designing armor-piercing naval weaponry.
Which is still wild to me.
Right. And then you blink your eyes, and suddenly it's the 1970s, the plaster is peeling off the walls, and you have squalid brothels, a famous murder, and a member of Pink Floyd losing his mind in a flat with painted floorboards.
And I still can't quite get over this part from our source material. A literal civil war.
Oh, the poetry wars.
Yes, not a metaphor, a physical confrontation involving the police. But the combatants were poets.
The Battle of Earl's Court. It is such a crucial part of British literary history, and it happened right there, in a house that used to belong to a weapons manufacturer. You just couldn't write fiction this symbolic.
You really couldn't. So that is our mission today. We are going to stand in the middle of this garden, metaphorically speaking, and watch the world rotate around us for 150 years.
We're going to trace how a cabbage patch became a fortress of empire, then a slum, and finally the multi-million-pound real estate you see today.
And we really need to peel back the architecture, too, based on those surveys we reviewed.
Yeah.
Because the buildings themselves, they're telling a story about psychology, about insecurity, and about this desperate need to be fashionable.
Absolutely. The facades are hiding so much.
But before we jump into the time machine, let's ground everyone. Let's visualize the location. So we are in West London, in Earl's Court. The square is situated specifically between Warwick Road on the west and Earl's Court Road on the east.
And it is a garden square. We should clarify that because that's a very specific London thing.
Yeah, explain that layout for anyone who hasn't been there.
Sure. So it's a communal garden in the center. Usually it's accessible only to the residents who have a key to the gate. And it's surrounded by these grand terraces of tall houses looking inward at the trees. It sounds incredibly tranquil.
It sounds lovely. But as we're about to find out, tranquil is probably the absolute last word I would use for its history.
It has been a lot of things, but boring is certainly not one of them.
So let's start at the bedrock. Section 1 of our dive today. Foundations and facades. Before the bricks, before the drama. What was actually here?
Mud and vegetables?
Mud and vegetables.
Yeah.
Just a farm.
Just a farm. For centuries, this was strictly agricultural land. It was part of what was known as the Earl's Court Farm. And originally, this land belonged to the Rich family.
Which is a great name for a landlord, by the way.
It really is, isn't it? The Rich family. And then later, ownership transitioned to the Edwards family. For generations, this was just the outskirts. London was miles away to the east. This area was where you grew the food that fed the city.
Right.
But then we hit the mid-19th century. And the monster starts to grow.
The expansion of London.
The explosion of London, really.
Yeah.
The railways arrive, the district line cuts right through the area, and suddenly growing cabbages in Earl's Court is just a terrible business model.
Because the land is suddenly worth a fortune.
Exactly. It's worth a fortune if you can stack people on it instead of plants.
Yeah.
So the Edwards estate makes the decision to develop.
And what's the timeline on that? Do we have a specific date from the records?
We do. Construction officially began around 1872 or 1873.
Okay, so we are deep in the Victorian era at this point. The British Empire is at its absolute height. And this is where we really need to talk about the look of the place. Because they didn't just build functional houses, they built a statement.
They really built the architecture of ambition. If you walk into Earl's Court Square today and look at those main terraces, what is the first thing you notice?
It's all white. It's incredibly grand. It looks like a giant wedding cake made of stone.
Exactly. It looks like stone. But here's the secret. It's a total lie.
It's a lie.
A complete fabrication. That is not stone. That is brick. Cheap, usually fairly ugly brick, entirely covered in a layer of stuff called stucco.
Okay, let's unpack stucco for a second. Because you hear that word on property shows all the time. Oh, it's a stucco-fronted property. What actually is it, chemically speaking?
Chemically, it's a render. It's a mix of lime, sand, cement, and maybe some crushed marble if the builder's feeling fancy. You literally smear it over the brickwork like icing on a cake.
Wow, okay.
And then you score deep lines into it to trick the human eye into thinking it's made of heavy, individual blocks of masonry. And then you paint it.
So it's basically a theatrical makeup for a house.
It is pure theater. The Victorians in this area wanted to project immense power. They wanted their homes to look like the great Italian palazzos of the Renaissance. That's why the dominant style in the square is what we call Italianate.
So that explains the columns.
Yes. You see the upper floor balconies supported by those heavy columns. Those are Italianate dressings. You have the heavy cornices, the pillared porches. It's all designed to create this overwhelming sense of verticality and grandeur.
It's sending a message.
Exactly. It says, the person who lives here is a person of substance. They are as solid as Rome.
Even though their house is actually just made of brick and plaster.
Precisely. And there's a massive catch to this. Using stucco in 1870s London was a really high-risk strategy.
Why is that?
Well, think about the air quality in 1873.
Oh, right. Coal smoke. The famous pea super fogs.
Exactly. The air was practically solid with sulfur and soot. Now, what happens to a highly porous, bright white plaster wall in a sulfurous atmosphere?
I imagine it doesn't stay bright white for very long.
It turns gray, then it turns black, and then the sulfur actually attacks the lime and it starts to peel off in these huge, ugly chunks. It literally looks like a skin disease on the building.
Oh, wow.
So living in a stucco house was actually a double flex. You were telling society, I can afford to buy this massive house, and crucially, I can afford the army of painters required to repaint it every 2 years to keep it white.
It's like owning a white Ferrari today or something. You're telling the world you can afford the insane maintenance.
That's spot on. It is the architecture of insecurity. They were desperate to look established. But here is where the core sample gets visually really interesting. Because the square isn't actually uniform.
All right, looking at the architectural survey we have, it's quite a mix.
It is. Alongside all that Italianate stuff, you have clear influences of the Second Empire style.
Which sounds very Star Wars, but I'm assuming it's French.
It is French. Think Napoleon III. Think grand Paris boulevards. You'll see mansard roofs, those very steep roofs with the windows set into them, and very distinct dormer windows.
So you have a bit of fake Italy, bit of fake France.
Yeah, but then if you walk to the south side of the square, specifically the terrace numbered 30 to 50 suit C3, you step into a completely different movie.
These are the houses that were built later, right?
Yes. The whole development of the square took about 20 years, eventually finishing around 1890. And by the time they finally got to building the south side, the fashion had changed completely.
So what are we looking at when we look at numbers 30 to 52?
We are looking at the Jacobean revival.
Okay, so we've ditched the fake Italian stone by this point.
Completely ditched it. Gone is the white stucco. Now we have red brick. We have incredibly ornate terracotta details. We have these uniquely shaped gables at the roofline, sometimes called Dutch gables.
Why the sudden switch? Did they just run out of white paint?
No, they ran out of patience. You really have to understand, the Victorians were obsessed with style, but they got bored so easily. By the late 1880s, people were absolutely sick of the endless rows of white stucco.
They were over it.
They called it drab. They thought it was soulless and repetitive. The aesthetic movement had kicked in. People wanted texture, they wanted color, and crucially, they wanted something that felt English.
Because the Italianate style was too foreign.
Exactly. The Jacobean revival looked back to the 17th century, to the reign of James I. It felt native, it felt domestic and warm.
So the square literally captures that exact moment in history where Londoners collectively decided we are done with the fake columns, bring us the red brick.
It's a fossilized change in taste. You can see the timeline written right in the mortar. And, it gets even more complex when you factor in the apartments.
The mansions.
Right, the mansion blocks. We've got Weatherby mansions, Herbert Court mansions, and Langham mansions. These are large, purpose-built apartment blocks that just coexist right alongside the houses.
I've always found the term mansion block quite funny. It is clearly just marketing.
It is 100% marketing spin, because in the 1880s, respectable middle-class English families did not live in flats. Flats were for the poor or they were continental.
Which, again, was highly suspicious to the Victorians.
Extremely suspect. The idea that you lived on one floor with strangers living literally above your head, it was scandalous.
Yeah, so how do you convince wealthy people to buy them?
You call it a mansion. You put a very imposing porter in a brass-buttoned uniform at the front door. You build this incredibly grand entrance hall. You make it sound like a sprawling country estate. And it worked beautifully. These blocks became highly desirable.
And just to finish the architectural tour of the square, we have the modern layer, the addition of Northgate House in 1965.
Which, I'm sure you can guess, looks absolutely nothing like the others.
Nothing at all. So you have agricultural roots, Italian ambition, French roofing, English revival brick, and 1960s modernism, all facing the exact same patch of grass.
It's an incredible ensemble.
So the stage is completely set. We have these grand, confusing, ambitious buildings. Now we need to populate them. And this brings us to section 2 of our dive. High culture and high society.
The Golden Era residents.
The list of people who lived in this square in the late 19th and early 20th century is just staggering. And there's a distinct theme. It seems to be this intense mix of heavy industry and high art.
It really is. It serves as an incubator for people who, and I don't use this phrase lightly, who genuinely changed the world. Or at least they fundamentally changed their corner of it.
Let's start with the art side of things, specifically the ballet. This square is basically hallowed ground for British dancers.
It is. The absolute key figure here is Ninette de Valois, the dame herself.
The dame. She lived at number 23. This was actually her parents' home initially, and she lived there at the very start of her career. Now, we really need to contextualize her for a moment. Because she didn't just do ballet, she essentially built the entire infrastructure of British ballet from zero.
Because before her, it didn't really exist here as a major institution, right?
Not as a national homegrown institution. If you wanted serious, prestigious ballet back then, you looked to Russia or you looked to France. De Valois was just an absolute force of nature.
Yeah.
She founded the Sadler's Wells Company. She founded the Royal Ballet School. She founded the Royal Ballet itself.
So imagine this. You're walking past number 23 in, say, 1920 or so. You look up at the window, and inside there is this young woman who is mentally constructing the entire future of dance in the United Kingdom.
The discipline it requires is just insane.
Yeah.
Ballet is all about rigorous, often painful perfection. And she was plotting all of that out in a house originally designed for lazy Victorian gentility.
It's a great image. And she wasn't the only one. Sir Frederick Ashton is also listed as a notable inhabitant of the square. He was arguably the greatest British choreographer of the 20th century.
It's amazing. It's like a vortex for dance talent.
It suggests that the area had this very specific cultural cachet. It was wealthy enough to be comfortable, but maybe just on the edge enough to be artistically interesting. But then, and this is where the contrasts come in, you look 2 doors down, and the vibe changes completely.
Number 21.
Earl's Court Lodge.
This is the home of Sir William Palliser. Now this guy, he was not choreographing delicate dances, he was choreographing destruction.
He was a brilliant inventor specifically of ordnance, heavy naval weaponry.
The Palliser shot. I read up on this in the bios we pulled, and it is fascinating.
It is, and to understand why his presence in the square matters, you have to look at the naval arms race of the 1860s and 70s. This was the era of the ironclads. Suddenly, navies around the world were wrapping their old wooden ships in these incredibly thick iron plates.
So the old school cannonballs were just bouncing right off.
Boing. Exactly. It was a massive problem for the British Empire. The Navy had these huge, powerful guns, but they just couldn't penetrate the new French or Russian armor. Palliser solved it.
How did he do it?
He invented an entirely new way of casting the projectiles. He used something called chilled iron. Essentially, he cast the artillery shot point down in a metal mold.
Okay, what does that do?
Well, the metal mold cooled the tip of the shell very rapidly. This rapid cooling made the nose of the shell incredibly hard. Brittle, yes, but intensely hard. And then the rest of the shell, the body, was cast in sand, so it cooled much more slowly and stayed tough and resilient.
So when it actually hits the enemy ship,
The nose doesn't squash or deform. It punches through the iron armor plate like a needle, and the tough body of the shell follows it right in, shattering the inside of the ship. It was absolutely brutal. It changed naval warfare overnight.
and he is designing this terrifying weapon in a nice stucco house in Earl's Court Square.
That is the exact juxtaposition I love about this place. At number 23, you have the ultimate grace and elegance of the human form, the origins of the Royal Ballet. At number 21, you have a man mathematically calculating the best way to send a heavy piece of iron through the hull of a battleship to kill everyone inside.
It perfectly captures the duality of the British Empire right there. The high culture and the extreme violence, just living side by side in matching houses.
And you had other major figures, too. Frank Gielgud lived there, the father of the famous actor Sir John Gielgud. Later on, you had Sir John Egan, a highly notable businessman in the 1960s. These were all people who made things happen on a grand scale. The square was a genuine power center.
Nothing stays golden forever.
No, it doesn't. Cities are living organisms. They breathe in, they breathe out, neighborhoods rise, and they inevitably fall.
And Earl's Court Square fell hard. Which brings us to Section 3, the slide into squalor.
The gritty 1970s.
If we get back in our hypothetical time machine and jump from the glory days of the 1920s to, say, 1972, what are we seeing when we look out the window?
You are seeing a very, very different world. The historical surveys are actually quite blunt about it. They describe the square by the 1970s as extremely run down.
How does that happen? How do you go from Sir William Palliser and Dame Ninette de Valois to extremely run down?
It's the mechanics of the post-war city. First, you have the servant crisis. Those big vertical 5-story houses were essentially machines, and they ran entirely on cheap human labor. You needed maids to haul coal up 4 flights of stairs just to heat a bedroom.
Right.
After the 2 world wars, nobody wanted those jobs anymore. And the middle class certainly couldn't afford to keep fully staffed houses.
So the houses just become unmanageable for a single family.
Exactly. Who wants a massive, drafty house with no central heating and no staff to clean it? So the original wealthy families move out to the suburbs or downsizes, and the landlords move in. They buy up these mansions and they chop them up.
The multi-occupation era.
Yes. They throw up flimsy partition walls, put a cheap padlock on every bedroom door, install a coin-operated gas meter in the corner, and rent them out by the week. The population becomes highly transient. And when a population becomes transient, the fabric of the community starts to fray very quickly.
And obviously the maintenance completely stops.
Remember the stucco we talked about?
The peeling skin. The white Ferrari that nobody is washing.
Exactly. By the 70s, it's gray, it's cracked, it's falling off in dangerous chunks onto the pavement. The beautiful iron railings are probably rusting or missing, and into this vacuum comes the underworld.
The notes we pulled for this section are grim. We aren't just talking about a bit of litter or some noisy neighbors. We are talking about organized vice.
2 specific brothels are explicitly mentioned in the records operating right in the square. One was at number 9. Another was operating out of the AL block of Weatherby Mansions.
And the phrase used in the source text is squalid brothels.
Which implies a whole lot. These were not high-class, discreet establishments for gentlemen. These were dangerous, intensely unsanitary places. We know this for a fact because they were eventually evicted not by the police vice squad, but by the borough's health inspector.
That is such a grim detail. It wasn't just treated as a crime. It was literally a public health hazard.
And that kind of environment attracts serious violence. There was a murder, described as a sordid murder, that occurred at number 4.
It's almost impossible to reconcile this with the ballet dancers, isn't it?
It is, but this is the established life cycle of grand London squares. Wealthy origins, post-war obsolescence, severe decay into multi-occupancy, and neglect. The 1970s was the nadir, the absolute lowest point for the area's reputation. It was a really rough place to be.
And I think this is the great paradox of urban decay squalor is cheap. and cheap rent attracts artists.
Precisely. The establishment flees to the suburbs, and the counterculture moves right into the ruins.
Which perfectly transitions us into Section 4, psychedelics and counterculture. Because right in the middle of all this grime and danger, we find a massive rock star,
Syd Barrett.
the original frontman and founder of Pink Floyd.
He lived at 29 Weatherby Mansions. The records show he moved in around January 1969.
Now, we really need to set the scene for Syd here, because this is not the Syd Barrett playing sold-out stadiums with lasers.
No, not at all. This is Syd on the way down. He has already been kicked out of the band he founded. His mental health is rapidly deteriorating, heavily fueled by intense LSD use. He is actively retreating from the world.
And he chooses to retreat to Earl's Court Square.
It makes perfect sense for him at that time. It was a place for outsiders. He lived in that flat with the artist Dougie Fields.
I've actually seen photos of that apartment from later years. Dougie Fields eventually turned it into this incredible pop art masterpiece.
Yes, but in 1969, imagine the stark contrast. Outside the window, you have the rotting Victorian facade, the gray London sky, the transient bedsits, maybe the squalid brothel just down the hall. And inside, you have these brightly painted floorboards, mattresses thrown on the floor, incredibly loud music playing, and a musical genius who is slowly, tragically losing his grip on reality.
It's almost poetic, in a way. The building was decaying, shedding his old aristocratic identity, right at the same time Syd was shedding his pop star identity.
It connects Barrett so deeply to the architecture of the era. He wasn't living there because it was posh. He was there because it was a ruin. And ruins are places where you can hide.
We also have Joan Buck, the American writer and actress, listed as living there during this period. It really became a bohemian enclave.
It did. It was gritty, it was undeniably dangerous, but it was incredibly creative. The knights and the dames were long gone. The freaks had officially taken over the castle.
And speaking of freaks taking over the castle, we absolutely have to talk about the battle.
Oh, the Battle of Earl's Court.
This is Section 5. And honestly, when I was reviewing the research notes, this is the part that made me stop and reread the page twice, because it sounds like a Monty Python sketch, but it was entirely real.
It was very real and very intense.
So let's go back to number 21.
Right. Sir William Palliser's old house, the naval gun inventor.
Right, by the 1970s, who was occupying the gun inventor's grand house.
The poets. Specifically, it housed the Poetry Society and the Poetry Society Bookshop.
Okay, so I'm picturing tea, biscuits, quiet readings of rhyming couplets. It sounds very peaceful.
You would certainly think so. But the 1970s was a volatile time for everything in Britain, and that included poetry. There was a massive, bitter ideological split in the British poetry scene.
Who were the combatants in this war?
Well, in the blue corner, you had the traditionalist factions. These were the old guard. They controlled the society. They firmly believed in strict form, in narrative verse, in proper, respectable English poetry.
The literary establishment.
Exactly. And in the red corner, you had the modernist factions. These were the young radicals. They were part of what's known as the British Poetry Revival. They were heavily influenced by American beat poets, by chaotic sound poetry, by performance art. They basically wanted to tear up the traditional rulebook and burn it.
So what actually happened? Did they just write incredibly passive-aggressive letters to each other?
Oh no, it went way beyond letters. The modernists organized a literal coup. They realized that if they just got enough of their radical friends to join the society and vote, they could legally take over the Council of the Poetry Society. And they did exactly that. They seized control of the organization from the inside.
They seized power.
They seized the means of poetic production. They literally took over the printing press in the basement of number 21. They turned the ground floor bookshop into a massive hub for radical underground literature. They started using society funds to publish experimental work that the traditionalists absolutely despised.
I'm guessing the traditionalists did not take this well.
Not at all. And more importantly, the Arts Council, the official government body that provided the funding for the society, was horrified. They thought they were giving taxpayer money for quiet culture, not for this radical anarchist takeover.
So you have a full-blown standoff.
You have a literal siege. It was documented historically as the Battle of Earl's Court. There were vicious shouting matches in the very hallways where Palliser used to design artillery shells. There were lock-ins. The police were actually called to the square.
The police were called to settle a poetry dispute.
Officer, arrest this man. He's using free verse.
Exactly.
It sounds hilarious to us now, but the stakes for them were incredibly high. They were fighting for the very future of British poetry. They were fighting for limited funding, for national visibility, and it was all happening right there, centered at number 21.
I just love the historical irony of it all. You have a house built by a man who made literal weapons of war, and 100 years later, it becomes a metaphorical and almost physical battlefield for a civil war between angry poets.
It perfectly highlights the cultural volatility of the 1970s. We usually just think of the 70s as a time of economic decline or the birth of punk rock. But even in these supposedly highbrow circles, there was deep rebellion, clashing ideologies everywhere. Everything was up for grabs.
So at this point in our timeline, we have hit rock bottom. We have squalid brothels, unsolved murders, drug-addled rock stars, and rioting poets. The square is an absolute mess.
It is on the brink of total collapse.
But we all know the ending to this story, because if you go to Earl's Court Square today, it is immaculate. It is full of multi-million-pound flats. The stucco is painted bright white again. How on earth did we get from the poetry riot back to the pristine recovery?
This brings us to section 6 of our dive. Conservation and legacy. The square obviously didn't stay squalid forever. The major turning point was the year 1975.
What happened in 1975 to turn the tide?
The square was officially granted conservation area status.
Now, here is a detail from the survey that I found completely fascinating. Despite the massive architectural ambition, despite having residents like Palliser and de Valois, there are absolutely no listed buildings in the entire square.
That is surprising, isn't it? Usually grand Victorian terraces with that much history would definitely be grade a second listed in London.
So what is the actual difference between a listed building and a conservation area? Why does it matter?
A listing protects a specific individual building. It says, this one structure is a unique masterpiece. You cannot touch the windows. You cannot alter the interior. But a conservation area protects the broader environment. It protects the vibe.
The vibe of the square.
Right. Legally, the planners call it protecting the character and appearance. It recognizes that the true value of the area isn't necessarily in one specific house, because remember, the architecture is a total mishmash. Some are fake Italianate, some are Jacobean, some are massive mansion flats.
Right.
The value is in the ensemble, the way all these different buildings group together and face inward around that central garden.
So granting that status basically saved the context of the neighborhood.
Exactly. Once that status was formally granted in 1975, it sent a massive signal to developers and investors that the area was officially protected. The Wild West era of the 70s was over.
And the cleanup began.
Yes. The Arts Council eventually cut the funding to the radical poets, and that society basically imploded. The borough cleared out the remaining brothels, the transient bedsits were bought up, and the houses were slowly, painfully renovated back into single-family homes or luxury apartments.
And the garden itself survived through it all.
The garden is the one constant in this entire story. We should also mention Farnell Mews, which runs just from the east side of the square. That layout survived too. Through the agricultural farming era, the frantic Victorian building site, the golden era of the ballet, the slum era of the 70s, and the modern multi-million-pound recovery, that one patch of green remained. It's a complete Victorian ecosystem that somehow managed to heal itself.
So if you walk through those gates today, you aren't just seeing a sterile museum piece. You're looking at a survivor.
You really are. You're seeing a veteran, a building ensemble that has been scrubbed completely clean, but has seen things you just wouldn't believe.
It really is an incredible journey when you lay it all out like this. I mean, we traveled from the Edwards family farm straight through the massive construction boom of the 1870s.
We saw the architecture of ambition rise up in fake stone.
We visited the homes of the people who built the Royal Ballet and the people who armed the Royal Navy.
We watched it all completely fall apart during the post-war servant crisis.
We hung out with Syd Barrett in the squalor of the 1960s.
And we witnessed a literal poetry civil war.
It brings us right back to that core sample idea from the beginning. Earl's Court Square is just a perfect example of how a single location can wear so many different masks over a century.
It reflects the changing face of London itself. London is constantly dying and being reborn. This square is just a very, very concentrated version of that cycle.
And that is exactly what I want you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive today. Because we all walk past buildings every single day. Maybe it's a house on your commute. Maybe it's your own apartment block. And you look at it and you just see bricks.
You just see the surface layer.
But if the walls of number 21 Earl's Court Square could talk, They would scream. They would talk about armor-piercing shells in the 19th century and shouting poets in the 1970s.
Every building has a secret history. You just have to be curious enough to drill down and look for it.
So here is our final provocative thought for you to mull over today. What seemingly quiet building in your neighborhood is hiding a wild history of battles, genius, or crime? Next time you walk past that old, quiet house on the corner, just stop for a second. Imagine who was living there 50 years ago. Imagine who was pacing the floors 100 years ago.
You might be truly surprised by what you find.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you in the next one.
Bye, everyone.